Title: America fired 500,000 workers overnight, and the economy started freezing. Host: John A.G., The Currency Archive. Word count: 4,611. Mansamin. At 9:47 in the morning, 500,000 people stopped being legally allowed to work in America. Not fired by their bosses, not replaced by machines, erased by a single sentence from a White House trade advisor. No warning, no phase-out, no exceptions. And within 12 minutes, not 12 days, not 12 weeks, 12 minutes, the entire North American economy began to seize up like a diesel engine running without oil. This is what actually happened, and I promise you, by the time you understand the full picture, you will never look at a border crossing, a bag of pasta, or a pipeline the same way again. But before we go any further, if you're getting valuable information from this, drop the word gold in the comments right now. Just that one word. It pushes this content toward people who need to see it, and it costs you nothing. Now, let's go back to that morning. The announcement. There was no emergency broadcast, no red ticker flashing on Bloomberg terminals, no alarm bell ringing on the floor of any exchange. The first sign that something catastrophic had just broken open was silence. An eerie, spreading silence, crawling out of the automotive parts plants scattered along the Interstate 75 corridor, that long industrial spine threading through Michigan and southern Ontario. The machines didn't stop. The workers did. Because 30 seconds after a brief, unscheduled address from the White House, a senior trade advisor delivered one sentence that cracked the foundation of continental commerce. Effective immediately. No waivers, no grandfather clauses, no exceptions. No Canadian citizen would be granted work authorization in any sector of the American economy. That was it. One sentence. And the world paused. Not metaphorically. Literally paused. The trading algorithms at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, systems sophisticated enough to price the probability of a hurricane hitting a Louisiana refinery 4 months from now, those systems hit a wall they had never encountered before. They didn't crash. They froze. Because the engineers who built those models had prepared for everything. Tariffs, sanctions, trade wars, armed conflict, currency crises. They had never been asked to price the instantaneous removal of over 500,000 skilled workers who crossed an international border every single morning and came home every single night. And here's the thing that makes this different from any crisis you have ever watched unfold on a screen. These were not temporary visa holders in some seasonal exchange program. These were locomotive engineers, pipeline corrosion specialists, heavy diesel mechanics, seed calibration technicians, metallurgists who had been working in the same facilities for decades, workers whose daily presence in the American economy had been so constant, so reliable, so completely woven into the operating fabric of critical industries that no economist had ever bothered to model their absence, because nobody ever imagined they would have to. The first collapse. 12 minutes after the announcement, the theoretical became brutally physical. In the rail yards of Minot, North Dakota, Canadian locomotive engineers who had been legally crewing cross-border freight for over a century were ordered off their trains by Border Patrol agents following the new directive. Stop. Think about what that means. A century. These workers weren't operating under some recent bilateral deal hammered out in a modern trade negotiation. The operational framework governing their work predated the Interstate Commerce Commission itself. It was written in an era when the line between the United States and Canada was barely a pencil mark on a paper map, not a policy weapon, not a labor choke point. But on that morning, it became both. The trains didn't slow down, they stopped. Each idle locomotive was sitting on 11,000 tons of North Dakota spring wheat, already sold, already contracted, already set for cash settlement within 48 hours. The buyers were Japanese millers, and if you know anything about Japanese commercial relationships, you know that Japanese millers do not accept late delivery. They do not recognize political labor policy as a force majeure event. And they had long-standing relationships with Australian and Ukrainian grain suppliers who had been watching this situation with great interest, waiting for exactly this moment of American disruption. The first phone calls from Tokyo that morning were not to Washington. They were to Sydney and Odessa. That detail should chill you, because those calls didn't just cost American farmers one shipment. Those calls started the process of rewriting permanent supply chain relationships. And permanent is exactly the right word. We'll come back to that. The trap nobody saw. Here's the contradiction that almost nobody anticipated. Every piece of political rhetoric building toward this moment had been aimed squarely at white-collar workers. Tech jobs in Seattle, finance roles in New York, software engineers in Toronto billing American companies from their kitchen tables while American workers struggled. The narrative was sharp and emotionally effective. Canadians in comfortable home offices taking American jobs, earning American salaries without ever setting foot on American soil. That was the rallying cry. That was the political fuel. But when the policy detonated, the explosion didn't come from Silicon Valley's talent pipeline. It came from a diesel mechanic crawling under a locomotive in Bismarck. It came from a corrosion specialist monitoring pressure sensors on an underground pipeline in Michigan. It came from a seed technician calibrating a fungicide applicator in a farm equipment shed in North Dakota. The political class had been aiming at the wrong target entirely, and the physical economy, the one that actually moves things, builds things, powers things, was paying for it. Canadian crews operate 62% of the heavy repair facilities for American rail rolling stock along the Northern Corridor. 62. BNSF and Canadian National Railway simultaneously lost 40% of their qualified mechanical staff in a single morning. Norfolk Southern issued a quiet internal memo within hours of the announcement. Bureaucratic tone, measured language, but what it said was devastating. Locomotive availability would drop below reserve levels within 96 hours. Reserve levels are not a comfort buffer. Reserve levels are the legal minimum required to maintain federal safety certification. Below that threshold, trains don't run slower. They don't run at all. But the rail collapse, catastrophic as it was not the trapdoor. The trapdoor was underground. Enbridge Line 5. 540,000 barrels of light crude and natural gas liquids, moving every single day from Wisconsin to Sarnia, Ontario, through a pipeline that requires daily inspection and maintenance by Canadian engineers living on the American side. Here is the savage irony. These engineers were operating under TN visa status, a category created by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the same agreement the president who just signed this order had personally championed. These weren't undocumented workers. These weren't people gaming the system. They were workers operating inside a legal framework America itself had constructed. These engineers monitor the cathodic protection systems, the underground electrical barriers that stop the pipeline corroding into the soil. They calibrate pressure sensors that catch leaks before they become front-page disasters. And they are not replaceable. The training pipeline for a single pipeline corrosion specialist is 5 years of supervised field apprenticeship. Not 5 months, 5 years. By 2 in the afternoon, the pipeline operator confirmed that its entire Michigan-based inspection team had been stripped of work authorization. The pipeline did not shut down immediately. Pipelines physically cannot stop immediately. The controlled shutdown sequence takes days, a precise choreography of valve closures and pressure rebalancing that requires the very engineers who had just been removed. So the clock started ticking. 72 hours to force curtailment. Refineries in Sarnia, which supplies 70% of Ontario's gasoline, began contingency planning for a complete feedstock cutoff. And before anyone had publicly confirmed whether that pipeline would actually close, gasoline futures on the New York Mercantile Exchange spiked 8%. 8% in a single afternoon. Because traders understand something that policymakers apparently did not. Uncertainty is more expensive than certainty. A confirmed problem can be priced and hedged. An open-ended unknown cannot. The sentence that explains everything. Here's the sentence that reframes everything you're watching unfold. This was not a trade war. Trade wars involve tariffs. Tariffs create friction. Friction that can be calculated, modeled, passed through to consumers, absorbed by margins, hedged on futures markets. Friction is manageable. This was a labor blockade, and labor is not a flow you can redirect like water. Labor is a stock. You cannot ship a trained locomotive engineer from a warehouse. You cannot air freight a pipeline corrosion specialist from a surplus depot. You cannot order 12,000 heavy rail mechanics from an online supplier and have them delivered by Thursday. The replacement timeline for a single certified heavy rail mechanic is 18 months and $60,000 in training costs, assuming you can find a candidate with the prerequisite qualifications. You can't, because the entire North American training infrastructure was built on the foundational assumption of cross-border labor mobility. There are no surplus certified Americans sitting in reserve, already trained, already experienced, ready to step into these roles. That worker does not exist, and you cannot manufacture him in 96 hours. By the close of futures trading, soybean oil had spiked 9%, not because anything had physically happened to soybeans, but because 40% of American soybeans get crushed into oil and meal at Canadian processing facilities, serviced by American electrical technicians under reciprocal work agreements, that reciprocity was now legally dead. And the market didn't wait for Canadian retaliation to arrive. It priced the expectation of retaliation instantly. That is what a confidence collapse looks like. Carney moves first. The Canadian government responded within 4 hours, and what Prime Minister Mark Carney did was not what anyone expected. He didn't issue a counterban. He didn't reach for tariffs. He moved like a central banker, because that is precisely what he is. Carney had run the Bank of Canada. He ran the Bank of England. He navigated the 2008 global financial collapse and the 2016 Brexit referendum, events that shattered lesser minds. He understood something pure politicians almost never grasp in a crisis. The first mover sets the terms. What Carney announced was surgical, asymmetric, and nearly invisible to anyone not watching the financial plumbing. All United States financial institutions operating in Canada would be required to file daily compliance reports on any transaction involving cross-border payrolls. Read that carefully. It wasn't a ban, it wasn't a tariff, it wasn't a headline-grabbing counterstrike. It was a compliance trap, engineered to make American banks so terrified of accidental violations that they would freeze Canadian-linked payroll accounts preemptively rather than risk a single error. The penalty for one compliance failure under Canadian financial law? $25 million per incident. No bank's risk committee accepts that exposure. No compliance officer signs off on that gamble. Within 6 hours of Carney's announcement, 3 major American banks had instructed their Canadian subsidiaries to halt all payroll processing for American citizens working remotely from Canada. American workers, people who had nothing to do with this policy, people who had no vote in it, no power over it, no warning about it, suddenly unable to receive their own salaries. The policy designed to protect American workers had made it legally impossible for American workers abroad to get paid. The irony is almost too sharp to absorb. The port seizure. Then the shipping system cracked. The Port of Vancouver processes 90% of Canada's containerized exports bound for the United States. The cranes, the gate operations, the chassis pool, all managed by a joint American-Canadian workforce. American logistics supervisors working in Vancouver, unable to enter Canada under reciprocal enforcement. Not because Canada had banned them, but because the United States had voided their own authorization to work on the Canadian side of their jobs. America had accidentally fired its own logistics managers. The port slowed 30% within 24 hours. That backlog hit Los Angeles and Long Beach exactly 42 hours later. The 2 largest container carriers in the world didn't wait for diplomatic resolution. They simultaneously rerouted all Canada-bound American cargo through Prince Rupert. Smaller port, deeper water, virtually no rail capacity for the volume. The bottleneck shifted to a single-track line through the Fraser Canyon, 1 passing siding for every 18 miles. Trains that normally ran that corridor in 18 hours were taking 48. Perishable goods, fresh produce, refrigerated meat, pharmaceuticals with cold chain requirements, arriving at temperatures that violated safety standards. The first insurance claims were filed within 72 hours. The farm door closes. Now here is where the damage becomes irreversible. Not disruptive, not recoverable, irreversible. Every spring planting season in the Northern Plains, North Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, depends on Canadian seed cleaners, soil testers, and equipment calibrators crossing the border daily for roughly 12 weeks. 12 weeks. That is the agricultural window. These workers aren't credentialed engineers with advanced degrees. They're technicians who operate seed treating equipment, precision machines that apply exactly calibrated doses of fungicide and bacterial inoculants to wheat, barley, and canola seed before it enters the ground. The calibration tolerances on this equipment are measured in grams per hundredweight, fractions of a gram off, and the seed either rots in the soil from underdosing or gets chemically burned from overdosing. The technicians who know these machines were gone. North Dakota State University's Extension Service estimated that without this specialized workforce, 85,000 acres of durum wheat, the specific high-protein grain used for pasta and couscous, would not be planted that season. Think about that number for a moment. The global pasta supply chain was already operating on thin margins. Italy's durum harvest had been hammered by successive heat waves. France was in the same condition. Global inventories of high-protein wheat were already below comfortable buffer levels. A 15% reduction in Northern Plains planting before a single seed went into the ground sent Italian millers to their phones within 6 hours. Not calling Washington for reassurance, calling Australia, calling Kazakhstan. Those suppliers, who had been watching this unfold in real time, raised their prices immediately. 12% premium, effective now, no negotiation. The American farmer wouldn't see that premium. The American farmer couldn't deliver. The premium went to whoever could. Contracts for fall delivery were being rewritten in real time. American names crossed out, new names written in. And that's a transaction that does not reverse itself when political conditions change. The seaway locks shut. Here's the layer that almost nobody caught in the first 24 hours. The announcement landed at the precise moment the Great Lakes shipping season was opening. That narrow annual window when the St. Lawrence Seaway clears of ice and bulk grain carriers can move stored harvest from Thunder Bay to Montreal for export. Those carriers are crewed by Canadian sailors who hold United States Coast Guard operating licenses, allowing them to navigate American portions of the Great Lakes system. Those licenses, void as of that morning. The grain that could not be planted also could not be shipped. The billions of dollars of already harvested American wheat and corn sitting in storage elevators across Minnesota and the Dakotas had no path to Tidewater without Canadian crews. Alternative routes, rail south to the Gulf of Mexico, rail west to the Pacific Northwest, were both already at full capacity. Rail was at full capacity because of the locomotive engineer shortage. The system had locked itself in a loop with no exit. The institutional void. What came next exposed something Washington had no interest in admitting. There was no plan. Not a contingency plan, not a partial contingency plan, not even the outline of one. The Department of Homeland Security held authority to revoke work authorizations. It had zero authority to replace the labor those workers provided. The Department of Labor had real-time data on developing shortages. It had no jurisdiction over Homeland Security decisions. The Federal Reserve had sophisticated models for demand shocks, supply shocks, financial contagion, and currency crises. It had no model for a sudden continental labor decoupling, because such an event had never occurred in any modern integrated economy. A regional Federal Reserve president, speaking anonymously to a policy research group, said internal simulations showed a 4% contraction in manufacturing GDP within 90 days if the policy held. 4%. That is the equivalent of erasing the entire American automotive parts sector overnight. That is the economic output of an average-sized American state. Gone. In 90 days. And then this Fed president said something that should have been front-page news everywhere. The models were almost certainly underestimating the damage. Because economic models cannot quantify what was actually walking out of American facilities that day. Tacit knowledge. The undocumented, unwritten expertise that lives only inside the head of a worker who has performed the same task on the same equipment in the same conditions for 20 years straight. You cannot train a replacement for it. You cannot download it. You cannot replicate it with a 6-week certification program and a motivated new hire. It was walking out of American plants in real time, boarding buses to Winnipeg and Calgary, and it was not coming back. And right now, if this is shifting how you see what's actually happening in the economy, drop success in the comments. Just that one word. It tells us this content is landing with people who actually want to understand the real mechanics behind these headlines. Success. Drop it now. Carney names the trap. Carney's live address that evening didn't look or sound like a political speech. It felt like a risk manager briefing a board of directors on a building that had just caught fire while the smoke detectors were still being debated. No political theater. No flag waving. He laid out structural reality in language that left no room for misinterpretation. The United States had just imposed a labor embargo on itself. Because every Canadian working inside the American economy was simultaneously enabling an American industry that had built no domestic replacement for what that worker provided. Every Canadian engineer in a Michigan pipeline facility was also keeping an American refinery operational. Every Canadian mechanic in a North Dakota rail yard was also keeping American grain moving toward American export terminals. Every Canadian technician calibrating seed equipment in a Montana farm shed was also protecting an American farmer's spring harvest and fall revenue. Removing them didn't protect American workers. It pulled the scaffolding out from under American industries that had been leaning on it for 50 years without ever acknowledging it was there. Carney offered no labor retaliation, because Canada didn't need to retaliate. The asymmetry was already doing the work, and once redirected, it does not reverse course. The world doesn't wait. The global buyers moved while the diplomats were still drafting statements. Japanese automakers dependent on just-in-time delivery of Canadian-manufactured transmission components flowing daily across the Detroit River began emergency air freighting replacements from Mexican plants. at 6 times the transportation cost. The cost was irrelevant. Reliability was everything. Mexican plants had labor that could cross borders without political risk. Canadian plants could no longer offer that guarantee. Korean shipbuilders requiring Canadian steel plate processed through American mills by Canadian metallurgists canceled 3 contracts outright and rewrote specifications for European plate from Germany and Sweden. European plate is more expensive. Different chemical properties. Complete retooling of forming presses required before production could begin. Retooling takes 6 months. The Korean builders accepted 6 months of delay over indefinite uncertainty. Because indefinite uncertainty is not a business condition, it is a business catastrophe. Once a supply chain moves, it does not move back. The sunk cost of rerouting becomes the fixed cost of a new permanent operation. The old relationships become expired contracts. The American supplier who lost that Korean order is not getting a call back when the political climate shifts. The Korean builder has a new supplier now, one who showed up when the American one couldn't. The hidden machine breaks down. By midnight on day 1, something had settled across every trading desk, every rail operations center, every farm cooperative, every refinery control room from Sarnia to Houston. Not panic, something colder and more permanent than panic. Clarity. The policy had not conjured a crisis from nothing. It had revealed a hidden machine, a system that had been running invisibly beneath the American economy for 5 decades, powered by daily, ordinary, utterly irreplaceable cross-border labor, running so smoothly and so silently for so long that the people nominally in charge had forgotten it existed. No backup had ever been built, no redundancy had ever been designed, no contingency plan had ever been written. Half a century of deep continental integration had produced a machine so precisely tuned, so tightly coupled, so completely optimized for frictionless operation that removing one category of workers didn't just slow it down, it removed the operators. And a machine without operators doesn't idle gracefully, it stops. The reckoning arrives. The markets delivered their verdict before the sun set on day 1. Agricultural commodity futures across every grain category, refined petroleum products, steel and manufacturing inputs, shipping insurance rates, everything moving simultaneously, down or spiked, depending on which side of the disruption you were positioned on. One senior economist at a major investment bank, whose name you would recognize immediately, reportedly told a client call that morning that the firm's disruption framework had been built around a maximum cross-border labor shock of 5%. The actual shock was 100%. Their models weren't wrong because they were poorly built. They were wrong because they had been built for a world that no longer existed. The shift that doesn't reverse. Here is the final truth, the one that no congressional hearing, no diplomatic communique, and no policy reversal can change. Labor does not return the way capital does. Capital is liquid. Capital responds to wire transfers and interest rate signals. Labor is crystallized years of accumulated training and experience, and irreplaceable tacit knowledge embedded in a human being who makes life decisions based on whether a specific job in a specific country is stable enough to build a career around. When a Canadian locomotive engineer steps off a train in Minot and boards a bus to Winnipeg, that is not a worker taking a forced day off. That is a career pivoting. Within weeks of that morning, Canadian labor organizations were reporting surge increases in applications to Australian mining operations, German manufacturing facilities, and British infrastructure projects, in some specialized categories by over 200%. Same skills, different destination. And the training pipelines, the apprenticeship programs and certification pathways and mentorship networks that feed the next generation of specialists into the industries that need them, those were already beginning to reorient away from the American economy. Because every young Canadian looking at a career in heavy rail operations, pipeline engineering, or precision agricultural technology watched what happened that morning and ran one calculation. Why anchor your professional future to an economy that can legally eliminate your authorization to work with one sentence before your morning coffee goes cold? The answer was obvious, and it determined a generation of career decisions that morning. The locomotive doesn't move. The locomotive in the North Dakota rail yard did not move that day. It did not move the next day. The Canadian engineer who had crewed that specific line for 16 years, who knew every signal, every gradient change, every mechanical quirk of that route, was on a bus to Winnipeg by noon. That locomotive will not run again under American operation for months, possibly longer. Because what is missing is not a machine. What is missing is the knowledge of how to run that machine safely, in this precise place, under these specific operating conditions, within the legal certification requirements that keep the line open. That knowledge left on a bus. The border is still there. The locomotive is still in the yard. The wheat is still in the elevator. The pipeline is still in the ground. The planting window is still technically open for a few more days. But the system that made all of it function, that system just discovered it has no backup, no spare capacity, no contingency, no plan B. America did not simply lose workers that morning. It lost the invisible architecture that had been holding its most critical physical industries upright. Industries that the political class rarely visits, rarely photographs, and apparently never fully understood. The buyers in Tokyo didn't wait. The millers in Rome didn't wait. The shipbuilders in Seoul didn't wait. The suppliers in Sydney and Odessa and Stuttgart didn't wait. They did what markets have always done when a gap opens. They moved into it. And when serious money moves into a gap, it fills it. And filled gaps don't reopen for the original party. The question is no longer whether the damage is real. The question is how deep it runs before anyone in Washington maps the full architecture of what was just dismantled. And the uncomfortable answer? Nobody in Washington is having that conversation yet. Because having that conversation means admitting something nobody in office wants to say out loud. That the American economy quietly built its most critical physical infrastructure on labor that crossed an invisible line in the ground every morning, not as a weakness, as a rational, efficient decision that made complete sense every single day, until the day it didn't. Every individual choice was logical. The collective result was a continental system with a single point of failure that nobody had ever audited. And the audit arrived not as a report or a hearing or a policy review. It arrived as a morning, one sentence, and a diesel locomotive sitting silent in a North Dakota rail yard, while the spring wheat waits and the planting window slowly closes. The border is exactly where it has always been. The dependency is gone, and the world, having already pivoted, signed new contracts, redirected supply chains, and rewritten relationships, has moved on. It didn't wait for America to understand what it had just done to itself. It never does.